Hello YouTube, I'm Dom the Musician. My name's Dom, I'm a musician. Here's my degree. In this series of videos, I'm exploring Murray Gold's music for Doctor Who Series 1 and looking at what makes it so fantastic. I'm going to be going through in roughly chronological order and talking about some of my favourite themes. I'll also be using some musical jargon, but I'll be providing a glossary of terms that you can find in the description. So even if you don't know anything about musical theory, you hopefully won't get lost. Let's go! So, who remembers the music from The Long Game? Oh, I hate it. But on the rewatch, there was one scene that did get my attention, and that is the scene where Suki goes to floor 500. In my notes I've written, nice synth pads. No, not synth pads. Voices. Female voices. Put through filters, like screams. Yeah, the vocals are really creepy. And they achieve two things. A, they convey how cold it is up there, because for some reason we associate high frequency sound with cold, and low frequency sound with warmth. And B, they're just really unnerving. The sliding between pitches makes it seem less musical, and more like regular human speech. And the only time I can think of where you'd get someone giving a long drawn out ah, other than a yawn, is when they're screaming. There's great use of panning too. Obviously people watching on the telly wouldn't pick up on this, but when you listen through headphones, you realise that the two vocal parts are panned to opposite sides of the stereo. And that sounds really unnatural because usually vocals are placed right in the centre of the stereo. It's particularly apt because Suki is looking around, she's exploring, she's in an unfamiliar setting, and there's a sense that danger could come from any direction. I mean, it's not a great episode, but I'd really forgotten how scary this scene was. At this point you get a heartbeat drum. It's a bit of a horror cliche, but as I've said before, if it works, it works. Then there's some really dissonant piano that reminds me of the Series 4 episode Midnight, another great horror score from Murray. Then Suki meets the editor and there's this creepy waltz. Kind of mischievous, like Cassandra's Waltz from episode 2. But what's really messed up is that the melody is a hair's breadth from the Westminster Bridge theme, i.e. the Heroes theme. You know, this one. Westminster Bridge goes... Whereas here the melody goes... So it's the same melody, but without that comforting resolution. Maybe that's the editor trying to set her at ease, like, don't worry, ooh, you can trust me, but it's not quite convincing enough. Either that, or Murray didn't have much time to write the music, and had to reuse an old melody. We've all done it. The only other musical point I'd like to make about The Long Game is this Space Odyssey homage at the end. You've got this shot of the sun rising over the earth, there's a big major chord, some timpani, and it sounds just like this. Murray wrote in the album liner notes, Father's Day really needed a nostalgic theme, something that made you feel like you'd heard it before. Well, if it feels like you've heard it before, it might be because you have. This is how the 1951 Frank Sinatra jazz standard I'm a Fool to Want You begins. I'm a fool to want you. I'm a fool to want you. And this is how Father's Day begins.
1987, 7th of November. Do you remember what I told you? The day that Stuart Hoskins and Sarah Clark got married.
I try not to read too much into that, but I think it's neat. I like to think it's the sort of record Jackie Tyler might put on when she's had a glass of wine and she's remembering Pete and the good times and the bad times. So Father's Day has two main themes, the first of which plays over the opening 3 minutes of the episode. There's a gorgeous modulation when the Doctor and Rose set off in the TARDIS as the G minor chord drops down into an F sharp major.
I want to be that someone so he doesn't die alone.
November the 7th.
1987.
It sounds hopeful, but also kind of menacing, because there's this flute melody that goes, suggesting this sinister tritone interval. After that, the rhythm breaks down, which is apt as they're travelling through time at this point. The cymbal crescendo serves to throw you off the beat, and the bassoon starts playing this 5-note run, which is either in quintuplets or it's just 5 semiquavers going out of sync with the 4/4 time signature. 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5. Either way, it's all very timey-wimey, and it's all played over this gorgeous D major 7 chord, which sounds so unresolved because the melody never reaches the top D. It wants to go, but it never does. It's like it's stuck in a time loop. The first time you hear the theme proper is during Jackie and Pete's argument.
What's it got to do with you, what he gets up to?
What does he get up to?
You'd know.
Oh, because I'm that stupid. I play around and I bring her to meet the missus. You silly
But
cow.
you are that stupid.
You get these lovely wide intervals in the piano with the same descending bass line as before. And for more on why a descending bass line sounds so sad, I very much recommend Howard Ho's video essay about Hamilton, link in the description. It's just so goddamn sad. I mean, the piano melody actually sounds like little teardrops. It's interesting how delicate the music is when the dialogue is so loud.
Jackie,
No
I'm
one's
making a
playing
living.
out
It keeps
like
us
a
fed,
big
doesn't it?
kid. Stop it!
I think that's really impressive because sometimes when you're having an argument with someone you love, you don't necessarily feel angry, you just feel miserable. It feels like both of you are trapped and you just want to help one another but you can't, and it just feels awful. Also, I've heard my marriage is absolutely fine. So then the Reapers attack, some people get eaten, and as the Doctor looks out the window and sees the driver, you hear the first iteration of the theme, which I guess links it to the first scene where Jackie's telling Rose about Pete getting run over. So maybe the first theme represents the original timeline where Pete died, and the second theme represents this new Divergent Timeline. Which makes sense because the next time you hear the variant theme is when Rose is lying to Pete about the childhood she never had.
You were there for us all the time. Someone I could really rely on.
It's a bit more stripped back now, more piano driven, because of course the piano is Rose's signature instrument. Then for the first time the music modulates to D minor. And you get this crazy flute arpeggio that would probably be really hard for a flautist to actually play, but Murray did most of the music here using samples, so I imagine all he had to do was just input the MIDI. It's really cool, this bit of the track, because up till now the music's all been very dour and funereal, and for the first time it feels like hope.
Right, no one touches that key. Have you got that? Don't touch it. Anyone touches that key, it'll be well. Zap.
But we're still in a minor key, we still have the dirge-like descending bass line because of course we're not out of the woods yet. So naturally the track ends in imperfect cadence. Which, if you don't know, is when, rather than resolving from the dominant to the tonic chord, which would sound very final, it actually ends on the dominant, making it sound unfinished. The Killers do this a lot. Speaking of Killers, this happens. Then the next time we hear the theme is this scene back at the window that clearly mirrors the earlier one. And here's where we get one of the gnarliest pitch bends of the whole series. Murray's done plenty of pitch bends before, but this one just feels like your stomach dropping from fear, like when you're on a roller coaster. And in a sort of inverse of the argument scene, the music's really expressive while the visuals are very subtle. It's just a long hold on Sean Dingwall's face as Pete silently accepts his fate. And I like how after this drum hit, the music just goes full horror film. You've got some filtered atonal synth pads and what sounds like the lowest notes of a really old piano playing a chromatic scale. And it makes sense. I mean, if you found out you had to get yourself run over, you'd be absolutely terrified. And then of course it segues beautifully into the variant theme once again. This is sort of its last hurrah, because I think Pete just wants to have one final moment in this alternate timeline. So we get the same chords as the variant theme, but no melody and a really slow harmonic rhythm. It's sort of like when there's something you have to do but you're afraid. You know, you dawdle, you procrastinate. And I never noticed this absolute perfect timing of the piano coming in when Rose says, "My daddy."
My daddy.
And then again on the timpani roll as he pulls away from Jackie.
I never read you.
And then of course the flute comes in, the flute of destiny. It's optimistic, but it's also sad. It's grave, but it's determined. It gives me chills.
I've got chills.
I think the scene went on a bit longer than Murray was expecting it to though, because the music goes a bit baroque. I mean, the tonality is all over the place.
How lucky am I, eh? So, come on. Do as your dad says.
After the D minor section, it uses a D major chord to springboard into G minor, before using an A chord to get back into D minor. And it seesaws between those two keys a few times, but always using this stepwise, often chromatic bass line. Then there's a bit of a tonal shift when Pete's hit by the car and the Reapers start to disappear. There aren't so many passing notes in the bass. There are a lot more major chords, the last of which is this rather kinky A flat major when the Doctor appears. But then that takes a step down to G minor when the Doctor says go to him, just reminding us that, you know, it's still a very sad situation.
Go to him. Quick.
And that G minor nicely springboards us into the final key of C minor. And as Pete's heartbeat starts to fade, the piano arpeggio gets slower and fainter until it eventually cuts out. And you're just left with this really tender moment of silence as he breathes his final breath. Heavy stuff. And just when you thought you'd heard the last of it, the original Father's Day theme comes in to play us out.
For some reason, Pete just ran out.
And it's like, history's back in place, the walls have sealed, and we're back with the theme we first heard at the beginning.
And she sat with Pete while he was dying.
I really like how when Jackie says, never found out who she was, it cuts to Rose and the piano goes, "It was Rose." Then as she and the Doctor set off back to the TARDIS, you get this harp playing a 3-note ostinato that goes out of sync with the 4/4 accompaniment.
Peter Allen Tyler, my dad,
as does the 5-note woodwind line I mentioned earlier. And it all ends on that lovely D major 7 chord, which is what's called an interrupted cadence, which, unlike a perfect or imperfect cadence, it feels sort of resolved, sort of unresolved. It's a very melancholy ending. That about wraps things up for today. Join me next time when I'll be talking about the music of The Empty Child and The Doctor Dances. Oh, and I finally thought of a sign-off. So, are you ready? Are you ready? Sign-off time. I've been Dom the Musician. Until next time, remember,